Hi everyone, this is Dr. McClellan. Hopefully you're able to hear this lecture okay. Today I'm going to be going through Athenaze's chapter 9, which is going to introduce us to some new concepts, particularly the active voice of participles. So for those of you who were in class and saw the assignment for this weekend, this practice of going through some of the different forms of the verbs that you get at the end of chapter 9 are going to be pivotal to kind of get all of this picture fit together. Participles, as I mentioned before, are really important in Greek because we see them very, very frequently. Several even ancient commentators talk about ancient Greek as being particularly obsessed with using participles to extend sentences and add them to make sentences a little bit more longer and complex, to add some flavor to them. So it's really important for us as we go through these recent chapters, particularly 8 and 9, to really pay attention to how participles are formed and, more importantly, how to translate them when we see them. But fortunately, once you really understand the system of how participles work, how they're formed, they're pretty easy to get a hang of and just as easy to kind of fit into a smooth translation, as we saw in class. In order to understand participles, we have to talk a little bit more about the third declension. So we're going to learn a few more forms of the third declension this chapter. As I've said before, Athenaze really tries to make a big project out of the third declension, but it doesn't really need to be so. The third declension really breaks down to that simple chart that we went through before. So if you have that chart memorized of all the different endings, os, ea, s, on, sias, s, and so forth, this chapter shouldn't really come as a big challenge to you. It's really just kind of figuring out where the different endings get plugged in. At the end of the lecture, I'll talk a little bit about how to express time with different cases, how to say when something occurs using the genitive, for example. We'll talk a little bit about that case at the end. So, just to review, participles are very simply verbal adjectives. Adjectives that describe nouns like the running man, the barking dog, the beaten army, the wounded soldier. But they come from verbal ideas: to run, to bark, to beat, or to wound, in those particular examples. So the reason this definition is so important to remember is that it's going to help you remember what to look for when you're identifying and breaking down a participle. Because they are adjectives, because they describe nouns, just like any other regular adjective, participles are going to have endings, like you've seen with the middle voice, that have a gender, number, and case. They have to tell us what they're describing in a sentence. But because they're coming from verbal ideas, participles also have to have a tense and a voice. Sometimes I'll want to say the barking dog, or the thing that is barked at, or the wounding soldier as opposed to the wounded soldier, active versus passive. Greek participles are also going to break down the same way. So today, just for a quick review, this is basically what we covered in chapter 8. So far we've learned how to make middle passive participles, or how to make participial ideas out of a middle voice in Greek. So for example, you've seen lou omenos, lou omene, lou omenon means ransoming, not loosening. That would be the active meaning of that verb, but rather ransoming, because we're still in the middle voice of this verb. Middle passive participles are really simple. All that you do to form them is take the verbal stem, whether it's lou, phile, or tema, in any kind of contracting form, throw amen, that's my participle infix that tells me to translate it with ing in English, and the first and second declension endings, os, a, and on, to have them match whatever noun they're describing in a sentence. So this gives me, in a regular formation, lou omenos, ransoming, lou omene, lou omenon, masculine, feminine, and neuter. In epsilon contraction, as you guys saw, philumenos, philumene, philumenon, because I'm just contracting that omen with epsilon at the end of phila. And finally, alpha contraction, timomenos, timomene, timomenon, with alpha and omicron contracting into omega. That's plain and simple how you handle middle passive participles in Greek, and they're very easy to recognize. Now, active participles form in a relatively similar way, but are a little bit trickier to recognize in a sentence because they contract a little bit. The basic formula that I want you to pay attention to at the top of the slide here is that you take the stem of the verb, and we're going to, for this example, use luo, because that's our really easy one to work with, add the infix ont, omicron, nu, tau. That's a very important infix you'll want to remember. Anytime I see ont, just like anytime I saw amen, that's going to be my infix to tell me that this is a participle, but in the active voice instead of the middle voice. Or in the feminine column, I'll use us instead, and I'll show you how that differs things a little bit. And then I'll use my 3-1-3 endings, third declension for the masculine and neuter, and first declension for the feminine. So what this gives me in the chart below is luon. This is just a very contracted form of lu with ont. When ont was tacked onto the end of the masculine nominative singular stem, it just contracts down to luon in the third declension. Remember, third declension nominatives are always a little bit random. You can't predict them, so it's luon, luusa, using the feminine infix for loosening in the feminine, and luon, also a contracted form of lu with ont. Remember, nominatives are really strange in the third declension, but once you get to the genitive, everything starts to follow the pattern you learned before for the third declension endings. So, the start of this with the nominative singular forms, luon, luusa, luon, because these are present active participles, I'll translate these not as ransoming, but rather as loosening, the active form of luo and its meaning, rather than luomai, the middle meaning of luomai for ransoming. So, luon, luusa, luon are my nominative singular forms for ransoming, my participles with this verb system. When I go to the genitive, you can see the pattern start to emerge here. I'll take my verbal stem lu, add ont or us, depending on the gender that I'm using. Ont for the masculine and neuter in red, us for the feminine in blue in the middle, and my 3-1-3 endings. In the third declension, the genitive ending is os, so luontos is of the loosening someone, luuses of the ransoming woman, luontos of the ransoming thing. Sorry, not ransoming, loosening. I'm getting these confused myself. These should be loosening. In the dative, luonti just uses the iota ending for the dative singular, the ransoming man. Luuse in the feminine, the loosening woman, and luonti, the loosening thing. So again, 3-1-3 endings. And then finally, accusative, luonta, using the ont in the infix for the masculine accusative singular, luuson in the feminine. And remember, with neuters, once I know the nominative form, luon, it's going to copy down in the accusative and the vocative. So I've finished my chart in the singular for those three genders. So let me go through them one at a time by gender, by column. So in the masculine column, we'll start with luon. No way to predict that form. You just have to know that all present active participles are typically going to end in on, omega nu, loosening, genitive luontos, dative luonti, accusative luonta, and vocative is always the same as the nominative, luon, o, loosening, so-and-so. Feminine is going to follow a different set of rules because it's going to use first declension endings and a different infix. It will look as follows, starting at the top in the nominative singular. Luusa, luuses, luuse, luusan, luusa. Those are the participle forms for the feminine. And the neuter, remember the rule. If you have a nominative form, which you can't predict in the third declension, luon, you're going to copy it down in the accusative and the vocative. Luon and luon will be used down there. The genitive, luontos, and dative, luonti, are exactly the same as what you get in the masculine. So as long as you know how the third declension works from the previous chapter or two, this should be a piece of cake. It's just simply following the rules that you've seen before and just knowing what to look for in the nominative. When you get to the plurals, everything is fairly regular for the most part. So let's go through the masculine column first. The nominative plural is luont with s. If you already know the third declension nominative plural ending, you'll use s for the masculine. Luonton in the genitive. And the dative plural is going to look a little bit different. It's going to be luusi, which sounds very confusing. This looks a lot like they loosen, the form you've seen before. But the difference here is just simply that the ending c, the dative c, beats up a couple things here. You can see in parentheses below. What I'm really looking at is a combination of lu, my stem, with the infix for the participle ont, and the dative plural ending c basically helps to contract that. Because sigma beats up tau and beats up nu, something you've seen it do before, We call this compensatory lengthening. Sometimes when there's a lot of contraction or a lot of consonants that are eaten up when contraction happens, the stem, or the infix in this case, will lengthen a little bit to show that some kind of change took place. So rather than just being left with luasi, which would be very short and a little bit misleading because there used to be a new tau there, the Greeks lengthened it a little bit to luusi to tell us there's a little bit of change going on. So how are you going to handle this? How can you tell this apart from they loosen? The simple answer to that is just context. You have to pay attention to the sentence to see whether there's a nominative plural subject that needs a third person verb, so-and-so is loosening, or whether you have a dative plural somewhere that is looking for a participle. That's really all there is to it to handle luusi in the wild in a natural Greek sentence. But again, as long as you're using context and using your intuitive reasoning when you're reading through a passage, it's usually easy to kind of piece things together by figuring out where your subject is, your verb is, and the rest of the sentence usually can fall back into place. But do remember that luusi can also be the dative plural participle. So that'll be 2 or 4, the loosening men. Accusative, luontos, very straightforward, and luontes in the vocative, all following those third declension endings you learned before. The first declension endings for the feminine in the middle column, all perfectly regular, so I'll just go through these quickly. Luusai, luuson, luusais, luusas, luusai. Totally predictable, all first declension endings, just following us being thrown in there to make it a participle. That's that part that makes you translate it as ing. These will just be talking about groups of women, for example. The neuter, basically going to follow most of the masculine column with a couple differences. The nominative and the accusative and the vocative are all going to be the same because it's a neuter, and it's going to use alpha for the endings. So luonta, the loosening things, in the nominative, accusative, and vocative. The genitive, luonton, and dative, luusi, are exactly the same as what you get in the masculine because it's following the third declension. And that's all there is to it when you're handling participles in the active voice. No matter what verb you have, it's going to follow this system. So the only thing to really pay attention to at this point, once you know the basic formula, and again, I emphasize that rather than think about memorizing this whole chart, some 30 different forms, it's much easier to remember the formula that you have at the top here. You really just want to think about participles as a basic formula where you take a verb stem, like lu, add ont or us, depending on the gender, and your 3-1-3 endings. So following the third declension for the masculine and neuter, first declension for the feminine. If you can remember that basic formula, it's a lot easier to remember that than it is to try and memorize all these different changes that you see in here. That can be overwhelming, and it doesn't need to be. Just remember that there is a pattern, there is a rhyme and a rhythm to all this. So in regular verbs like luo, it's going to pretty much look like the chart that you saw on the previous slide. Luon, usa, on. On, usa, on are always going to be the endings that you typically see. However, with verbs that go through contraction, some slight changes will appear, but it's still following the same rules that you have up above. So for example, with a verb like phileo, or any epsilon contraction verb, instead of on, usa, on, you'll get philon, philusa. Notice there's a circumflex over that form. I'm now in the middle of the slide. And the neuter will be philoon. Why oon? Well, if you remember that epsilon and omicron give you oo, then you're going to see that contraction happen in the neuter. So rather than on, you get et-on or oon, philoon, the loving thing, for example. When you go to the genitive, it's still following the same rules as the chart you saw before, but remember, when epsilon and omicron run into each other, whether it's in ont or us, the infixes for the participles, you're still going to get contractions. So for the genitive, you'll get philoontos, of the loving man, philouses, of the loving woman, and philoontos, of the loving thing, if it's a tree, let's say. Same rules for alpha contraction. As long as you remember that alpha with any O sound gives you omega, it's very straightforward to follow. So Timon, the loving, or sorry, not the loving, the honoring man. Timosa, remember alpha with any O sound, including U, is going to lengthen to omega. Timosa, the honoring woman, and timon, the honoring thing. If a tree decided to give you a medal, for example, it would be timon dendron, the honoring tree. In the genitive, take a look at how this changes. Instead of timaontos, you get timontos. Alpha and omicron have contracted to omega. Instead of timauses, you get timoses. That alpha with the O sound contracts to omega. Timoses of the of the honoring woman, and timontos in the genitive. As long as you can remember the basic contraction rules, there's nothing new here. All the endings are the same. It's still following the same formula that you have at the top of this slide. The stem takes ont or us, depending on what gender it is, and those 3-1-3 endings, and that's all there is to it to add an active participle. So, just to recap, I went through this in the last chapter, but I think it's also always worth a refresher to go through the different ways that participles can be translated. It's well worth spending a little bit of time going back through some of the parts of Pratt, your Greek handbook, the little white book that was also assigned to you this semester, because Pratt does an excellent job of walking through how participles are formed and, more importantly, how they can be translated in different ways. You don't need to know the whole list of them right now. We'll add more of these over time as we start to get into more and more richer and more complex Greek over the next year or so. You don't really need to worry about that. It's something that you can pretty easily add to your arsenal when you get more comfortable with it. But for now, you are going to see a couple different ways that the participles can be used in a typical Greek sentence. But for the most part, just like with those middle participles, like ransoming, for example, present active participles are also going to be usually translated by just adding ing to the end of the word. So flying, working, loosening, fighting, honoring, and so forth. 99% of the time, that's going to mostly get the meaning across. So, for example, when the participle is attributive, when it's in the attributive position, it's going to work like a basic adjective. So you could have, for example, ha alturgos ho pauwon, the stopping farmer, the farmer who is stopping somebody else, for example. It's describing ha alturgos. They agree with each other. They're both masculine, nominative, and singular. If I want to switch it to a feminine noun, I could say he timusa basileia, the honoring queen, or the queen who is honoring, are both ways you can translate that phrase. Timusa, because it's a participle, is going to work like an adjective. It is feminine. Notice that it's usa, not onta. It is nominative because of the alpha ending. And it's singular. It's going with he basileia, the queen, word that you'll learn pretty soon in Athenaze. And that's mostly how the participles are going to be used. Occasionally, though, you will see them used circumstantially, describing a circumstance that accompanies the main action of the sentence. And it's usually when participles fall outside of this sandwich between the definite article and the noun. So for one example, you can see below, and this is kind of borrowing some of the same ideas we saw in the previous lecture, so you can go back to Chapter 8's video and review some of the middle voice versions of these sentences. Let's take a look at the first one underneath this bullet point. I'm going to read the Greek for you first. Ha autorgos eston agron bainon, there's my participle. Remember, on is the nominative ending. Ton lukon hora. So, bainon is my participle, and right away when I see a participle in a sentence, the first thing I want to do is find out who is it describing, because participles are adjectives at their heart. Well, I know from the previous chart that bainon, that on ending, is masculine, nominative, and singular. And if you're not sure why that is, take a second now and pause the video, or go back through the earlier slides, or you can use the PDF of these charts in your own notes. But if you go back through, remember, this is just the masculine, nominative, singular ending on. Once I know that bainon has to be talking about ha auturgos. They're both masculine, nominative, and singular. So it's the farmer who is bainoning, who is going somewhere. So where is he going? Well, I can use the rest of the sentence to start figuring this out. The farmer is tonagron bainon, going into the field, but I still need a main verb. The farmer has to do something in a third-person singular way, and that's when I get hora at the end of the sentence. the farmer going into the field sees the wolf. That's a perfectly easy way to translate this sentence, and that will get you full credit on any quiz if you can just handle it that way. But sometimes, depending on the context of a larger story, I might want to add a little bit more context to it. For instance, another way you can translate this to add a little bit of context to a story might be the farmer sees the wolf while he is going to the field. That's giving a circumstance for when he sees the wolf. When does it happen? It happens while he's in the middle of going to the field. That's when he saw him, for example. Switching it up a little bit, taking the same idea, I can change the participle to agree with something else in the sentence. It doesn't always have to be the subject who's doing the thing of the participle. So I could, for example, have a sentence, and this is the second bullet point here, read, Halukos, my new subject, ton aut orgon es ton agron bainonta. There's my participle in red, ukhora. So, first thing I'm going to do is take a look at this participle, bainonta. And the reason I can tell it's a participle is because of that ont infix that's been put in there. And once I can recognize that, I can start to break it apart. It comes from the verb bino, to go, so it's the same participle as above. So right away I can know I can translate this as going. Something is going somewhere. So I have to find out what it's describing. Well, if I look at the end of the word alpha, that can only be accusative, singular, going with, well, what? What's accusative singular in this sentence going with it? It could be agron, the field, but that doesn't really make much sense. If you think about it, fields don't really walk or go anywhere. So I can reasonably keep looking and find ton aut orgon earlier in the sentence. That makes more sense. The farmer is probably going. Sometimes you can just use your logic to translate a Greek sentence like this. And that starts to fit things together. So the main stem of the sentence is the wolf, halukos, does not see ukhora, the farmer, right? That's a pretty standard sentence. But if I want to add a little bit more context to it, I could say ton autorgon es ton agron bainonta. So one way to translate it is just like you would normally with participles, make it an ing sound. So the wolf does not see the farmer who is walking. Remember, the wolf isn't the one walking. The wolf isn't going here because bainonta is going without orgon. So it's the farmer who's going into the field. So translating it again naturally, the wolf does not see the farmer going into the field. Or more simply, I could say the wolf does not see the farmer while he, i.e. the farmer, is going into the field. So maybe the wolf sees him afterwards or beforehand, but once the farmer is bainontaing into the field, then the wolf can't see him, does not see him. And that's pretty much how the circumstantial participle works. And then finally, you've seen a couple examples of these, and again, if you translate a participle with ing, you can usually get the meaning across no matter what, but sometimes participles can complete the meanings of other verbs. So for example, pauomai, if I stop myself from doing something, I'm often going to see a participle going with that idea in a Greek sentence. So for example, one perfectly acceptable Greek sentence might be ha alt urgas u pauetai bainom. The farmer does not stop walking, does not stop going. That bainon completes the idea. What does he not stop doing? Bainon. I'll use the participle to finish the idea. But again, 90% of the time, probably higher, as long as you add ing to the end of any participle, you can usually translate it correctly and make sure to fit it with the right noun in the sentence by looking carefully at the endings. So, as I said before, the third declension can look really complicated at first, but the real way to handle it is to just memorize the endings that you see here. So remember, the nominative of any third declension is going to be random. There's no way for us to predict what the form is going to be, so we always have to look for the os ending in the genitive, and once we find that, we can add the rest of them. Os e a, s on sias s if it's masculine or feminine. And remember, if it's neuter, all you have to change is to make sure the nominative, accusative, and vocative are always the same in the singular and the plural is going to switch to alpha. So again, make sure you're spending time memorizing this chart in front of you. If you want to take a minute and pause the video and copy this down again, practice with the eraser game, make sure to do so. Give yourself the time to really know these forms backwards and forwards, know all the different case endings, and we'll be practicing with this a bit more. So, the reason it's important is because this chapter throws a lot of new third declension forms at you, and they can look a little bit complicated at first, and it's easy to get a little bit overwhelmed by all this new stuff from the third declension, but it doesn't need to be so. Remember, I just want you to focus on these endings and see how they play out in these different forms. So this chapter gives you a couple different types of stems that use third declension endings. One type, which you've already just seen a form of, are what we call new tau stems, nta, at the end of a stem. One example, geron, gerontos, which means an old man, a man who was old, a very common word. You'll see it in Greek quite a lot. This is basically just what we saw with the participles. If you already know what participles do with all these different endings, you can already decline or give me the endings of geron, gerontos, which happens to be masculine, of course, because it's talking about an old man. So geron, gerontos, my stem is now geront, geronti, geronta, that's my accusative, and geron in the vocative. Plurals, just like the participles we saw before. Gerontes, geronton, nominative, genitive. Remember the dative plural. Gerontsi is going to turn into gerusi because sigma is going to beat up those other consonants, and it has to lengthen. So gerusi instead of gerontsi, and then gerontas, gerontes. Very simple. Any noun that forms like this, geron, gerontos, you'll see a couple others that are like this. Archon, archontos, you'll eventually see, means a ruler, for example. All going to follow this basic pattern, no deviation from this. The ones that are a bit more tricky in this chapter that you should spend a little bit more time paying attention to are what we call the vowel stems. And to understand what's going on here, you'll notice that polis, city, looks way different from some of the other third declension nouns that you've seen because it goes through a couple shifts, is that you're really looking at a really interesting linguistic phenomenon with vowel stems in the third declension. You don't have to know all this, but I find it helpful to understand why these endings are behaving so differently from the other third declension nouns that you've already seen that have been behaving by following the chart that you've been spending so much time memorizing. Before I get into that, I just want to go through a couple nouns that follow a relatively similar pattern that end in vowels. So one example, a very important word that you'll see a lot in Greek literature is polis, poleos, which is a feminine noun, he, that means a city, like Athens or Thebes or Sparta. These are all polis in ancient Greek literature. Or a city-state is another important way you can translate this term. Let me just walk through the forms really quickly, and hopefully you'll start to see some of the patterns that are recognizable from the other parts of the third declension. So starting in the nominative in the singular column, you have polis, the singular nominative form of a city. The genitive is poleos. So rather than os as the ending, notice it's changed a little bit to poleos. And originally, early texts had this form as poleos. So if you guessed that this was going to have an os ending, you're not completely wrong, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But for now, you want to memorize this this noun, as polis poleos. Poleos is the genitive. Dative is normal, polei. Accusative, not regular at all. Doesn't use alpha, but instead becomes polin for the city in the accusative. But you've seen new, the consonant used before for the accusative. So this isn't entirely new, but this shows that words like polis go through some interesting linguistic shifts. We don't have to get too much into that right now. Vocative, also irregular, hence why it's in a red box. It's poli. If I talk to a city and say, oh, city-state that I love, I'd say, oh, poli, oh, poli. Let's look at the plurals. The nominative plural, if I have multiple cities, is poleis, totally regular. That's just the stem pole, which you see up above, if I take away the os ending from the genitive, with s as the ending, and it just contracts to ace. Totally regular. Totally follows the rules of the third declension. Poleis, the cities. Poleon in the genitive of the cities. Polesi, totally regular in the dative plural, to or for the cities. And then, weirdly enough, the accusative should be poleos, we would expect, but instead it's poleis, which is a little bit strange, but that is the accusative form of cities. So pay attention to not just the endings, but also the definite articles. If you see tas polis, you're going to know that it's accusative plural, as long as you know your definite articles. And then, of course, the vocative is just going to copy the nominative, so it's also going to be polis if I talk to a bunch of cities in Greek literature. So, pay attention to this now. Write this chart down for your own purposes. Copy this down if you have the PDF of the PowerPoint. But make sure that you know these endings. It's just an irregular verb that follows its own thing. As a bit of a reward for fighting your way through this, I'm going to give you a bit of trivia. If you ever go to Turkey and visit its not its capital, but one of its main cities of Istanbul, you can actually impress people by telling them it actually comes from a Greek phrase. Istanbul originally came from the phrase Eistan Poland, literally meaning into the city. So when people said, "Where are you going?" and they said, "I'm going Istanbul'in," in the local dialect, they meant they were going to what eventually would become Istanbul in Turkey. So it's a little bit of trivia if you want to have that and show off to people for any particular reason. All right. Let's look at another vowel stem. This time we're going to look at a neuter noun. So right away, because I know this is neuter, I know that a lot of the forms are going to copy. In the nominative, accusative, and the vocative, they're all going to be the same in the singular and the plural. Another word for a city, what literally means more of a city center rather than a polis, which was more of an idea of a city-state in addition to being a physical city. So the astu was just more or less kind of like a downtown of Athens, for example. The word astu has the same type of genitive as city. It is astu asteos, just like polis. So right away, you can tell that there are a couple words that are going to follow this type of pattern, which I'll go through a little bit later. So nominative, astu, the city. Genitive, asteos, just like you saw with polis. Dative, astei, so far we're in familiar territory, and safely we can say astu is going to be the same in the accusative and vocative, so we're home free. Fortunately, nothing new to learn here. Now, let's take a look at the plurals. Remember, if you want to find the stem of any third declension noun, you go to the genitive. When I take asteos and take my os, or really os, ending away here, I'm left with the stem aste, with an epsilon, which is why astu, like polis, is what we call a vowel stem. When it goes to the plural form in the neuter, when I tack on my alpha endings, I'm going to get a contraction taking place. So aste with alpha, astea, contracts to aste with an eta. Epsilon and alpha will give me eta here. So aste, even though it looks at first glance like it should be a feminine noun, is actually a contracted form of the neuter plural, but you'll hopefully remember that by memorizing astu, asteos as a neuter noun. As long as you remember that, you'll be able to recognize the form with ta aste, the cities, in the neuter plural. Genitive plural, totally regular, asteon, just added the third declension ending. Dative plural, regular, astesi, and as long as you know what to do in the nominative, the accusative and vocative are the same, aste and aste, the cities, or if I talk to a bunch of cities, I'll say o aste. All right, so that's really all there is to vowel stems, and I'm just going to show one more here before we talk a little bit about what's happening with these strange vowel stems. Very important word in Greek, basileus, basileos, which means a king. So the nominative form, this is a third declension noun. You can't predict it. There's no way to predict it. There's no way to know this other than to memorize it, is basileus, basileus, the king. The genitive, just like the verbs or the words we saw before, basileos, basileos. So remember, it's omega sigma, not os, basileos. Dative, basilei, very regular. Accusative, nice and easy, basilea, the king. All perfectly normal. Vocative, a little bit different, basileo if I talked to a king rather than basileus, so a slight change there. Now, where this goes to the plural, you see a couple different forms of kings, and this again is going to reflect some changes that are happening in the Greek language. In some early texts, you'll see just an eta, where two epsilons contracted to the sound of eis in either eta or epsilon iota. Each of those are basically the same thing. They're the stem basile with the third declension ending s contracted together. So rather than having basileus, you have basileis, spelled one of two ways that you can see in the nominative plural there. So just be aware that both of those forms can show up in different forms in Greek literature. Genitive plural, basileon, easy, perfectly normal third declension ending. And the dative plural, basileosi. Again, I'm just kind of adding basile with C and lengthening it a little bit. So it's just basileosi, slightly irregular, but again, easy to recognize as dative plural. And the accusative, basileas, the kings. The vocative is just the same as the nominative, basileis, spelled one of two ways. So, you might be wondering, after all this, well, wait a second, all of these third declension endings I've been memorizing now look like they've been thrown out the window. What happened to that nice chart I was supposed to memorize and tattoo on myself with os, e, ah, and so forth? And the short answer to that is a very complicated phrase, quantitative metathesis. Maybe some of your eyes have gone cross. Quantitative metathesis is not that complicated a concept. What really happened with these genitives that went from eos to eos is actually just an exchange, hence metathesis, of quantities or lengths of vowels. So what's really happening here is that we're looking at some nouns that have been changed by Athens. I've mentioned that Athens and its dialect Attic are really the outliers for much of Greek literature. They see a lot of different shifts take place in the language when things move from Ionia in the eastern Greek part of the world to Athens. But take a look at this chart here, and this will hopefully help explain what's happening with these nouns in the genitive. So polis, for example, a city-state, if you were to read any text in Ionic Greek, which would include things like the Hippocratic corpus, or other things that came from largely the Ionian Islands or the western coast of what's now modern-day Turkey, so places like Ephesus and elsewhere, had a perfectly normal third declension ending of eos. Tes poleos was the earlier and regular form of the city. But notice something's interesting here. Eos is very similar to eos as an ending because you essentially have an E sound, this time eta, followed by an O sound of os, eos. So, in other words, you have long E, eta, followed by short O, a, long E, short O, right? All that quantitative metathesis means is that you flip those lengths between Ionic and Attic. When Attic took up the language and changed it into its kind of Boston accent version of Greek, it switched the lengths from long E, short O to the opposite, short E, long O. It's the same ending, in other words, it's just a dialect that's making it different. So instead of eos, which it originally was, perfectly regular in Ionic Greek, the Athenians changed it to eos, but it's still eo as an ending. It's the same vowels, just in different lengths. So instead of a, long, short, you get o, short, long, short E, long O, eos. That's why you have poleos instead of poleios in Attic Greek, which is also what happens with king. If you read any Hippocratic texts or Ionic texts by Herodotus or other Greek authors who came from that part of the Greek world and said something belonged to a king or was of a king, you wouldn't see eos like you see in your textbook, but instead you would see tu basileios, eta omicron sigma, totally regular third declension. But over time, when it got picked up by Attic Greek, that changed the quantitative metathesis, changed it from eos, long E, short O, to eos, short E, long O, which you can see on the right. And same thing with city. Instead of asteios, which you would see in Ionic texts, the early version of Greek, perfectly regular, to asteios of the city, you get in Attic Greek to asteos of the city. So, if you don't want to remember that, just blame the Athenians. It's their fault that this Greek looks so weird to us, and unfortunately for us, so much of what we have to read comes from Athens that we really have to know these vowel stem forms. But fortunately, there is a rhyme and a reason to it. As long as you can remember that this is just a slight change in the vowels, this is all perfectly regular third declension with just a little twist to the genitive. So, again, in short, just blame the Athenians. It's a refrain we've come back to again and again in this course. A couple other nouns that are irregular in this chapter, meaning that they don't really follow a typical easy pattern that you can just apply the endings to. So the only thing you can really do with these nouns is simply spend time memorizing them and playing the eraser game to make sure you have the endings down. One is nous neos, meaning ship, and you can already tell from the genitive that it went through some changes as it went from Ionic Greek for ship to Attic in ship. And it's largely because of this transition that the different stems in this chart look so weird. Ship is one of those words that was spoken so often and so frequently that it got caught up in this shift from different dialects from one to the other, and as the language evolved over time. So the nominative singular is nous, our root for words like nautical or nautilus, a ship. Genitive neos, of the ship. Dative nei. Notice that's the long form. That's the earlier form with a perfectly regular dative singular. That's what it should have looked like if the noun stayed regular and stayed with neos, but it didn't. The accusative, also irregular, goes to noun instead of using a regular third declension ending. And then finally, if I talk to a ship, I'll say o nau, nau in the vocative down there. Plurals, also irregular. Nothing to do with this chart, but memorize this one, unfortunately. So the nominative plural for ships is nees, that old root with the eta. Genitive plural, neon, neon, the new Attic stem. Dative plural, nausi, totally irregular, just adding c to the end that you get from the nominative. Accusative plural, nous, also irregular, and then the vocative is going to be the same as the nominative, neas, o ships. You can tell the different endings more or less correspond to the third declension, so when you see the word for ship appear in a Greek sentence, it's usually easy to handle, especially if you look for the definite article going with it. But you do want to be familiar and spend probably a good 15 to 20 minutes just repeating the forms for ship to yourself. So for sometime this weekend, carve out some time to just go over this on your own and go through nous, neos, nei, noun, now, neos, neas, neon, nausi, nous, neas. There's nothing really to do but to memorize it, unfortunately. Same with boost. We've been seeing this word since the very beginning of the semester. Well, it's finally time to look at the whole thing put together. Unfortunately, the word for cow is also a little bit irregular, largely because it kind of gets caught in some of these shifts as well. So you've already seen that a cow, or an oxen, if it's singular, is bous, ha bous, the ox. Genitive, baos, it's a third declension noun, that's of a cow. Ba'i, to or for the cow or ox. Boon, the cow, if you're hitting a cow or tipping a cow or pushing a cow or something. Boon is the accusative singular form. So again, that's a little bit irregular, but it's similar to polis, which has that new ending for the accusative. And if I, for whatever particular reason, want to talk to a cow, I'll say, oh boo, oh cow. Okay? Plurals on the right side of the columns here. Boes for cows, totally normal, third declension ending. Boes, the cows. Baon, the genitive, baon, of the cows, totally regular. Bousi for the dative plural, also pretty regular. This is just baonsi, and remember, sigma beats up a lot of those endings. So bousi is the dative plural, and bous in the accusative. You can always remember that tous bous rhymes with each other. It's one of the most fun phrases you can say in Greek, and then the vocative is going to copy the nominative as baes, the cows. All right, so that is what you get for all the different third declension forms in this chapter, and there's a lot, but it's just important to spend some time with the chart and go through some of these different forms in the book. I recommend that you try writing them down with a different combination of the nouns with some adjectives, just to get some practice with them piece by piece, and we'll spend a little bit more time with them on Monday's class. Now that we have more participles under our belt, it's important to remember, in addition to some of the other ways to translate them, that participles can sometimes work on their own as nouns, just like any adjective. I could have the good, the bad, and the ugly as subjects in a sentence in English as in Greek. Participles can do the same thing, and it's important to pay attention because sometimes participles, when they stand on their own, when they act as nouns in a sentence without anything they're modifying can take on special meanings. For example, hoi theugantes, very literally you can tell it's a participle because of the ont in there, means the ones who are fleeing or the fleeing ones. But in Greek legal texts, it can actually mean something very particular, the people who are exiled. The ones who are fleeing a city, i.e. who have been kicked out of a city, are called theugantes, exiles, people who are kicked out. So it can take on a particularly technical meaning in some texts. Same thing with archon. Ho archon, you can see the ending on is a participle ending, literally means the one ruling, the ruling person. But in Athenian legal text, it can also be just simply translated as it appears. The archon was a very important political office in Athens, roughly like what we have for a president, somebody who is in charge of either the legislature or some other important business in the city. So we find lots of texts that refer to archons in Athens, people in charge of various offices and magistrates. So these are some examples of where participles can stand on their own and take a special meaning. So just keep those in mind. All right. So I mentioned at the beginning that you will see different expressions of time, and to understand that we also have to talk a little bit about the genitive. A couple of chapters ago I talked about the dative case and its various uses. You can review any of these by going back through Pratt, your grammar handbook, the little white book that was assigned to you as part of this class, who goes through all the different cases and the various ways that can be used in a sentence and how they can be translated. The genitive is fairly easy to get an understanding of because it usually is translated best with the phrase of. Most often the genitive is used to express possession, which you've already seen a couple times this semester. So for example, I could say ta to andros aratron, the plow of the man, or in natural English, the man's plow. Very simple thing to translate. Or he polis, a new word we've just seen, he ton Athenaion, the city of the Athenians, or more simply, the Athenians' city. That's usually how the genitive is going to work in most Greek sentences expressing possession. But sometimes it will express the larger whole of which something is a part. We call this the so-called partitive genitive, or genitive of the whole, which is translated the same way with of. So one example of this could be ton anthropon hoprotos, the first one, hoprotos, of men. Out of all men, out of the men, he is the first. He is the part of the whole expressed in the genitive. That's why it gets its name, partitive genitive or genitive of the whole. It helps you remember how to translate it. Another way to think of this, another example, could be ton paronton poloi, many poloi of the ones being present, paronton. So you can tell that this is a little bit different than the possessive idea above. The many people, the poloi, don't belong to, aren't owned by the ones present, ton paronton. They just come out of that group. They're a part of that whole. So we also translate it with of. Many of those present, out of that group, this part. And then finally, it's important to remember that some verbs, not as many as the dative, but some verbs will take the genitive in Greek, the most important of which is akouo, which we've talked about before. When you hear someone speaking in Greek, you hear them in the genitive because the stuff they're saying will be the accusative stuff that you actually hear. They're just the source of the sound. So for example, you will more often see a phrase like akouo tu emouphilou, I hear my friend, and whatever he's saying would be the accusative that goes later, but usually that won't happen in Greek. So those are some of the basic uses of the genitive, and those are the three I just want you to be familiar with for right now. In addition to understanding that, we also want to talk about how to talk about time, and this speaks to something more important to understand about some of the cases that you have in Greek. When you're talking about time and when something occurred, you're going to use different cases in Greek to express different ways of talking about when something happened. That sounds a little bit abstract, but I think it'll make sense when we talk through some specific examples. Some basic definitions I want you to remember, and you should probably write these down. The genitive, when it comes to time or space, this also works in a physical space sense, is used to express range or time within which something happens. So for example, if I have in a sentence, tes nuktos felgusin, I would translate that as they flee sometime during the night. I don't know when exactly during the night. It could be early, maybe early in the evening. It could be at 3 a.m. It could be right before dawn. The genitive of tes nuktos tells me I don't know exactly when. It's just sometime during the night. The range of the night is when this happened. That's all I can say for certain. It's not very specific. The genitive is always used for range when it comes to talking about space or time. The dative, on the other hand, is like throwing a dart at a dartboard. It is very precise. And so dative is what we use to say time when something occurred precisely. So for example, I could say te pempte nukti felgusin. When did they flee? I know exactly when they fled. They fled on the 5th night, exactly on that night. I can pinpoint when they ran away, and I'll use the dative to express precision. The accusative, finally, doesn't express a precision, doesn't express a range, but instead expresses duration of time. So changing the first sentence from tes nuktos to tein nukta felgusin means something very different. It doesn't mean they flee the night. They're not running away from the night. Instead, it means, expressing time here, they flee throughout the night. They didn't just flee at one point during the night, maybe just in the evening or just before dawn, but they fled the whole time, the entire duration of the night. So accusatives are used to express duration of time, or like the dative expresses time when in precision, and the genitive time within which or range. It's important to remember these because you will see these expressions a lot. Whenever you see a phrase that talks about a day, a night, some hours, a year, a week, any extent of time, you want to pay attention to the case that that time is in, because that'll tell you whether it's a range, precision, or duration. So I want you to memorize this list very carefully and make sure you have it handy as you go through the rest of this chapter and the rest of this book. It's very important to know how these cases express time. So that gets us to the end of the lecture. Your homework for this week, or this weekend, for Monday, I want you to prepare reading 9 Alpha after going through the rest of Chapter 9 on your own. Make sure that you use the PDF of this PowerPoint as well. And in addition to that, for Sunday night, for your participation sheets, you should do the basics. Tell me 5 things you learned this week, 5 things you want to learn from your reading, and 1 thing that you're doing outside of assigned homework to prepare for class. If you're meeting in small groups, I know that some of you have been meeting separately and some of you are going to tutoring. Fantastic. Tell me a little bit about how that's going, what's helping you guys with this Greek. But in addition to that, I also want you to show me that you're keeping up with the work for this chapter. What I want you to do, for those of you who weren't able to make it to class or forgot about it in the meantime, I want you to finish a couple verb charts with 3 different verbs, meno, boetheo, and horao. And you'll notice that one of them is regular, meno, one of them is epsilon contract, boetheo, and one of them is alpha contract, horao. What I want you to do is complete a chart of all their forms based on all the forms you've learned so far. Or in other words, just copy the charts that you see on pages 176 and 177 in Athenaze. You should give me all of the forms of these verbs in the active and middle voice, how to say I wait or I wait for myself, or I help myself. You should also show me how to make the infinitives of these verbs, how to make the imperatives of these verbs, and importantly, now that we've gone through them, how to make the present participles of these verbs. Make sure you do them in the active and middle voice. Take your time with this. This is not something you should rush through or feel like you need to do in a cram session, but spend some time with this. The more you review this stuff now, the better off you're going to be in future chapters. This is a great time to take a step back and just kind of recap all that we've covered for the verbs. And you'll notice, I think, that a lot of this will go a lot more smoothly than you might expect if you just trust yourself. You know a lot of this stuff already from a lot of practice in class. So make sure you keep up with this work, and if you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. All right, have a great weekend, guys. I'll see you guys on Monday.